The letter shook in Eleanor Winslow's hands as she read the words a second time, certain she had made a mistake the first time. Position of secretary required immediately. Estate of the Duke of Ashcombe. Payment generous. Candidates to present themselves at once. She had answered dozens of advertisements over the past 2 years, and every single one had turned her away the moment they learned she had no family name worth mentioning, no connections, nothing but a steady hand and a sharp mind. This one had not asked for any of that. It had asked only for skill. She folded the letter and pressed it against her chest, as if it might vanish if she let it go. Outside her narrow window, the town of Bramfield stirred awake, carts rattling over cobblestones, a baker calling out to a passing boy. Eleanor had lived in these 2 small rooms above a shop for 3 years now, ever since her guardian, Mrs. Constance Bramwell, had declared that a girl of 1 and 20 should learn to stand on her own feet. At the time it had felt like abandonment. Now she understood it had also been a kind of hiding, though she could not have said hiding from what. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing her plainest gray dress because it was also her best. There was nothing extravagant about Eleanor's appearance, and she had long ago stopped wishing there were. Her hair was dark and simply pinned, her eyes a clear brown that missed very little, and on her left wrist, hidden always beneath her sleeve, was a small mark shaped like a crescent moon, pale against her skin. She had never asked Mrs. Bramwell where it came from. She had learned, over the years, that certain questions were met with silence so complete it felt like a wall. The carriage ride to Ashcombe Hall took nearly 2 hours, and Eleanor spent every minute of it rehearsing what she might say, how she might sit, how she might prove in a single interview that she deserved a chance most women of her station were never given. When the carriage finally turned up the long drive, she pressed her face to the window despite herself. The hall rose out of the mist like something built by giants, gray stone and tall windows and ivy climbing toward the roof in patient green fingers. She had never seen anything so large that belonged to a single family. A footman led her through corridors lined with paintings of stern-faced men and women, who all seemed to be judging her plain dress and unremarkable shoes. She kept her chin level and her hands folded, refusing to let her nerves show on her face, though her heart beat so hard she feared it might be heard. The floors were polished to a shine that reflected the tall windows, and every corner of the hall spoke of wealth so old it no longer needed to announce itself. Eleanor had never walked through a place like this, and she found herself memorizing the details, the carved banisters, the smell of beeswax polish, the hush that seemed to settle over everything as if the house itself were listening. She passed a long gallery where more portraits hung, generations of Ashcombe men and women staring down with the same sharp, watchful eyes she would soon come to know so well. One portrait near the end of the gallery caught her attention, though she could not say why. It showed a woman with dark hair and a gentle expression, unlike the stern faces around her. And something about the tilt of her head made Eleanor slow her steps for just a moment, before the footman urged her onward. She had no time to wonder at it. At last the footman opened a set of double doors and announced her, and Eleanor stepped into a study that smelled of leather and old paper and something faintly like cedar. The Duke of Ashcombe stood by the window with his back half turned, and for a moment he did not move at all, as though her arrival had frozen him in place. When he finally turned to face her, Eleanor felt the strangest sensation, as if the air in the room had shifted. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 30, with dark hair swept back from a face that might have been carved rather than born, sharp at the jaw and steady at the eyes, but it was those eyes that unsettled her most. They moved over her face not the way a man looks at a stranger, but the way a man looks at a puzzle he has been solving for years and has just glimpsed the final piece of. "Miss Winslow," he said, and his voice was low and controlled, though something beneath it trembled faintly, like a held breath. "Please, sit." She sat. He did not sit across from her at his desk as she expected. Instead, he remained standing near the window, watching her with an intensity that made her wonder if she had somehow already failed some test she did not know she was taking. "Your letter of introduction states you have experience with correspondence and household accounts," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. I managed the ledgers for a merchant's household in Bramfield for 2 years, and I have kept my own correspondence in order my whole life. I read quickly, and I do not make errors twice." A confident claim. A true one, she said, before she could stop herself, and then flushed, certain she had spoken too boldly for a woman seeking employment. But the Duke did not frown. Something in his expression eased, very slightly, as though her boldness had answered a question rather than raised one. "Tell me of your family," he said. The question landed strangely, unrelated to secretarial duties, and Eleanor hesitated. "I have no family beyond my guardian, Your Grace." Mrs. Constance Bramwell raised me from childhood. My parents died when I was very young. I know little of them. Little, he repeated. Not nothing. Little, she said firmly, though her stomach had gone tight and cold. I was told my mother died in illness and my father before I was born. Mrs. Bramwell does not speak of it, and I have long stopped asking. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, studying her in a way that made the silence stretch thin. Then he asked, in a voice so carefully even, that she sensed the effort behind it, "And have you ever wondered why she does not speak of it?" "Every day of my life," Eleanor admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty. "But wondering changes nothing, Your Grace. I have learned to build a life from what I have, rather than what I lack." Something shifted again in his face, quick and gone before she could name it. He turned back to the window, and when he spoke again, his voice had returned to its formal register. "The position requires discretion above all else. You will have access to my private correspondence, my ledgers, and certain family papers of a sensitive nature. Can I trust you with such things, Miss Winslow?" "You may trust me completely." "We shall see." He turned to face her fully now. "The position is yours, if you want it. Room and board provided within the house, along with fair wages paid each month. You would begin tomorrow." Eleanor could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had expected a long process, further interviews, perhaps a trial period under scrutiny. Instead, the Duke had decided within minutes, and something about the speed of it, and the strange hunger in the way he had watched her while she spoke, told her this was not an ordinary hiring at all. "Thank you, Your Grace. I will not disappoint you." "See that you don't," he said, and though his words were plain, there was something underneath them that sounded almost like a plea rather than a warning. "One more matter," he said, just as she rose to leave. "You will find the household staff courteous, but I ask that you keep your duties to yourself. My affairs are not to be discussed beyond these walls." "Of course, Your Grace. I understand the value of discretion." He studied her a moment longer, as though weighing whether to say something else, but in the end he simply nodded and turned back toward the window. Eleanor curtsied and let herself out, aware of his gaze following her until the door closed between them. She left the study in a daze, following the footman back through the long corridors, past the judging portraits, out into the gray afternoon light. It was only when the carriage began its journey back to Bramfield that she allowed herself to breathe fully, to feel the astonishment of what had just happened. She had a position, a good one, in a grand house, with a duke who paid wages that would finally let her live without counting every coin twice. And yet beneath the joy sat something else, small and persistent as a splinter, the way he had looked at her. The questions about her family that had nothing to do with correspondence or ledgers, the moment his composure had cracked when she first stepped through the door, as though he had been expecting someone else entirely, or perhaps expecting her specifically, though they had never met before in her life. She told herself it was nothing. Noble men were often strange, raised in isolation with too much time to study the people around them like specimens. She would do her work well, earn her wages, and in time the odd intensity of that interview would fade into an unremarkable memory. She did not yet know that at that very moment, in his study, the Duke of Ashcombe stood with both hands braced against his desk, staring down at a folded piece of paper he had kept locked away for 3 years, a description written in a dying woman's careful hand, dark hair, brown eyes, a crescent mark upon the left wrist, a promise he had sworn to keep, no matter how long it took him to find the girl the world had tried to erase. He had spent 3 years searching every corner of the country for a lost heiress, whose very existence had been buried beneath lies. And today, without warning, she had walked into his study and asked for a position as his secretary, utterly unaware of who she truly was, or of the vow that had brought her, without either of them intending it, directly into his path. He did not yet have proof. A mark hidden beneath a sleeve was not proof. A likeness in the eyes was not proof. But some certainty settled into his chest that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with instinct, the same instinct that told a man when he had finally, after years of searching, found what he had been looking for all along. Tomorrow she would begin her work in his household, believing herself an ordinary young woman starting an ordinary position. He alone knew that nothing about her was ordinary at all, and that the coming days would test every promise he had ever made, including the ones his own heart had not yet spoken aloud. Eleanor arrived at Ashcombe Hall the next morning with a single trunk containing everything she owned, and by noon she had already been shown to a small but comfortable room on the family wing, far grander than anything she had lived in before. The housekeeper, a brisk woman named Mrs. Fairweather, walked her through the house with the efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times, pointing out the study, the library, the breakfast room, and warning her twice about the east wing, which she said was rarely used and colder than the rest of the house besides. His Grace keeps to himself mostly, Mrs. Fairweather said as they climbed the stairs toward the study. Works late into the night, he does, going through old papers like he's searching for buried treasure. Never says what for. Not my place to ask, and it won't be yours either, dear, if you want to keep this position. Eleanor filed the comment away, another small piece of the strangeness that seemed to hang over this house like fog that never quite lifted. She began her duties that same afternoon, and found the work itself blessedly ordinary after the odd tension of her interview. There were letters to sort, invitations to answer, ledgers to check against receipts from the estate's many tenants and suppliers. She worked at a smaller desk positioned near the window of the study, while the Duke worked at his own desk across the room, and for the first several days he said very little to her beyond brief instructions. But she noticed things. She noticed how his eyes would drift toward her when he thought she was occupied with her writing, quick glances that vanished the moment she looked up. She noticed the locked drawer at the bottom of his desk, which he opened only when he believed himself alone, and which he always relocked with a small brass key he wore on a chain beneath his shirt. She noticed that he sometimes stared at her hands as she wrote, an odd focus that made no sense for a man simply dictating correspondence. On the fourth day, while organizing a cabinet of old estate records at his request, Eleanor came across a portrait she had not expected to find tucked among the papers, wrapped in cloth and pushed to the back of a shelf. She unwrapped it carefully, curious despite herself, and found herself looking at the same woman she had glimpsed in the gallery on her first day. Dark hair, gentle eyes, a face that seemed familiar in a way Eleanor could not explain, though she was certain she had never seen this particular painting before in her life. "Put that away." The Duke's voice came sharper than she had ever heard it, and Eleanor startled, nearly dropping the frame. She turned to find him standing just behind her, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the portrait with an intensity that bordered on pain. "I am sorry, Your Grace. I did not mean to intrude. I was simply organizing the shelf and found it wrapped among the—" "It is nothing," he said, taking the portrait gently from her hands and wrapping the cloth back around it with careful, almost reverent movements. "A relative, long past. It should not have been left where you could find it. She is lovely," Eleanor said softly, unable to stop herself. "There is something in her face that feels familiar, though I could not say why." The Duke went very still. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and Eleanor wondered if she had offended him somehow, though she could not imagine how a simple compliment could cause such a reaction. When he finally spoke, his voice had regained its careful control, though something beneath it still trembled. "You have an imaginative mind, Miss Winslow. Many faces share a passing resemblance to others. It means nothing." He set the wrapped portrait on a high shelf, out of easy reach, and returned to his desk without another word. Eleanor returned to her own work, though her hands felt unsteady for reasons she could not name. The way he had looked at that portrait, and then at her, as though comparing them, measuring them against each other. It was not her imagination. Something in this house was not what it appeared to be, and she was beginning to suspect that she herself was somehow tangled in whatever mystery it held. That evening, unable to sleep, Eleanor found herself wandering the halls of the family wing with a single candle to light her way. She told herself she was simply restless, unused to the size and silence of the great house, but in truth, she found her feet carrying her back toward the gallery where the strange portrait had first caught her eye. She stood before it for a long while, studying the woman's face in the flickering light, trying to understand why something about those painted eyes made her chest ache with a feeling she could not name. Her name was Lady Catherine. Eleanor spun around, her candle nearly gutting out, to find the Duke standing a few feet behind her in the dim corridor, still dressed though the hour was late, as though he too had been unable to sleep. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not mean to wander where I should not." "You are not confined to your room, Miss Winslow. This house is not a prison." He stepped closer, his eyes moving from the portrait to her face and back again, that same searching quality returning to his expression. "Lady Catherine was a dear friend of my family. She died some years ago, under circumstances that were never fully resolved. I am sorry to hear it. As am I." He was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor sensed he was weighing how much to say. "Before she died, she asked something of me, a promise I intend to keep, no matter the cost or the time it requires." "What sort of promise, if I may ask?" His eyes met hers directly then, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. To find someone she loved very much, someone who was taken from her, and hidden away so thoroughly that even I, with all my resources, have spent years searching without success." Eleanor did not know what to say to that. There was something in the way he spoke, in the weight behind his words, that suggested this was not simply the story of a family friend, but something that mattered to him on a level she could not yet understand. She found herself wanting to ask more, to press further into the mystery that seemed to surround this house and this man, but something in his expression told her the conversation had reached its limit for the evening. "I hope you find whoever it is you are searching for," she said finally. "I believe I am close," he said, his voice quiet but certain, "closer than I have been in 3 long years." He bid her good night and disappeared down the corridor toward his own chambers, leaving Eleanor alone with the portrait in her racing thoughts. She looked once more at the painted woman's face, at the dark hair and gentle eyes so strangely familiar, and a chill passed through her that had nothing to do with the cold stone floor beneath her bare feet. She returned to her room and sat by the window for a long while, turning the conversation over in her mind. A promise to a dying woman, a search that had lasted 3 years, a portrait that felt like looking into a mirror she did not understand. None of it made sense on its own, and yet together the pieces seemed to be forming a shape just beyond her ability to see clearly, like a word on the tip of her tongue that refused to come. She thought too of the mark upon her wrist, hidden always beneath her sleeve, the one thing about herself she had never been able to explain. Mrs. Bramwell had always turned the subject aside whenever Eleanor asked about it, claiming it was nothing more than a birthmark, common and meaningless. But sitting in this grand house, surrounded by locked drawers and hidden portraits and a duke who searched her face as though hunting for proof of something, Eleanor found herself doubting, for the first time in her life, that anything about her past had ever been as simple as she was told. Sleep did not come easily that night. When it finally did, she dreamed of a woman's voice she could not place, calling a name that was almost, but not quite, her own. The following days brought a shift in the household's rhythm. The Duke grew more attentive during their working hours, asking Eleanor small questions that seemed innocent enough on their surface but left her feeling, each time, as though she had been tested and either passed or failed in ways she could not measure. He asked about her childhood memories, her earliest recollections, whether she had ever traveled beyond Bramfield before answering his advertisement. She answered honestly each time, though she began to notice how carefully he listened, how his pen would still over his papers whenever she spoke of anything before the age of 5 or 6. As though her memory simply stopped there and he found that stopping point significant. One afternoon, while the Duke was away meeting with a tenant farmer over a dispute regarding the eastern fields, Eleanor took the opportunity to speak with Mrs. Fairweather in the kitchen, hoping the older woman might offer some insight into the household's mysteries. She found the housekeeper kneading bread at the long wooden table, flour dusting her forearms, and asked, as casually as she could manage, about the woman in the gallery portrait. Mrs. Fairweather's hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. "Lady Catherine. A beautiful soul by all accounts, though I never met her myself. She passed before I came to serve this house, but the old staff still speak of her sometimes, when they think no one is listening. What do they say? That she had a daughter, once. A little girl who vanished before Lady Catherine's death, taken away under circumstances nobody would explain. Some say the family who took the child feared for her safety. Others say it was something darker, a scheme to steal what should have belonged to the child by right." Mrs. Fairweather shook her head, pressing the dough firmly beneath her palms. "It is not my place to gossip, Miss Winslow, and I would ask you not to repeat what I have said. His Grace does not care for talk of the matter below stairs." "I would never repeat it," Eleanor promised, though her mind was already spinning with questions she dared not ask aloud. A missing daughter. A dying mother. A duke who had sworn a promise and searched for 3 years. The pieces continued to circle each other in her thoughts, refusing to settle into any shape she could name, though something deep within her chest had begun to ache with a feeling too strange and too large to be simple curiosity. She thanked Mrs. Fairweather and returned to the study to continue her work, but she found it difficult to concentrate on the columns of figures before her. Her mind kept drifting to the portrait, to the Duke's careful questions about her earliest memories, to the mark upon her wrist that she had never been able to explain. She told herself repeatedly that she was imagining connections where none existed, weaving a story from scraps simply because the house itself seemed built for secrets. And yet the feeling would not leave her, persistent as a draft beneath a locked door. When the Duke returned that evening, weary from his meeting with the tenant farmer, he found Eleanor still at her desk, a stack of finished correspondence neatly arranged before her. He paused in the doorway, studying her for a long moment before crossing to his own desk. "You work later than I expect of you, Miss Winslow. I find the quiet hours suit me for careful work, Your Grace. I would rather finish a task properly than rush it toward evening. A commendable habit. He settled into his chair, though he did not immediately reach for his papers. Instead, he watched her a moment longer, his expression unreadable in the low candlelight. May I ask you something, and trust that you will answer honestly? Of course. Do you ever feel as though pieces of your own life are missing? Not simply forgotten, but taken from you, deliberately, by someone who decided you should not have them? The question struck Eleanor with such unexpected force that she set down her pen entirely, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Yes, she admitted, before she could think better of it. Every day of my life, Your Grace, though I could never explain why I feel it so strongly, or what exactly I believe has been taken. The Duke's jaw tightened, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might say something more, might finally offer the explanation that seemed to hover just behind his careful eyes. But instead he simply nodded, as though her answer had confirmed something he already suspected, and turned back to his papers without another word. Eleanor watched him for a moment longer, her heart beating strangely fast, before she too returned to her work. Though the silence between them now felt heavier than before, weighted with questions neither of them was yet ready to voice aloud. The rain began just after dawn and did not stop, drumming steadily against the tall windows of Ashcombe Hall as Eleanor made her way to the study, her mind still turning over the Duke's strange question from the night before. Do you ever feel as though pieces of your own life are missing? She had answered honestly, and in doing so had revealed something of herself she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even to Mrs. Bramwell in all their years together. She wondered now if that had been wise, or if she had simply handed the Duke another piece of whatever puzzle he seemed determined to solve. He was already at his desk when she arrived, dressed and alert despite the early hour, a stack of correspondence pushed to one side and something else before him that he covered quickly with a sheet of blank paper as she entered. Eleanor pretended not to notice, taking her seat and beginning the day's work, though her curiosity burned steadily beneath her calm exterior. They worked in silence for the better part of the morning, the rain providing a steady rhythm beneath the scratch of pens and the occasional rustle of paper. Eleanor found herself glancing toward the Duke more often than she should, noticing the way he kept touching the small brass key at his throat, as though reassuring himself it remained where it belonged. Twice she caught him watching her, and both times he looked away quickly, returning his attention to his papers with a focus that seemed more performance than genuine concentration. Just before noon, a maid entered to announce that a visitor had arrived, a Mrs. Bramwell asking to see Miss Winslow on a matter of some urgency. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Mrs. Bramwell never traveled without reason, and certainly never without warning. She rose from her desk immediately, murmuring an apology to the Duke, who had gone very still at the mention of the name, his eyes sharpening with an interest that seemed far too intense for the arrival of an ordinary guardian visiting her former ward. "Bring her to the drawing room," the Duke said to the maid, before Eleanor could suggest anywhere else. "I would like to greet her myself, if Miss Winslow does not object." Eleanor did object, though she could not say why beyond a vague and growing unease, but there was no polite way to refuse a Duke's wishes in his own household. She followed the maid toward the drawing room with her heart beating hard against her ribs, the Duke following a few steps behind, and found Mrs. Bramwell standing near the cold hearth, her traveling cloak still damp from the rain, her face pale and drawn in a way Eleanor had never seen before. "Eleanor." Mrs. Bramwell crossed the room quickly and took both of Eleanor's hands in her own, her grip tight enough to hurt. "I came as soon as I heard where you had taken employment. You must leave this house at once." "Mrs. Bramwell, whatever is the matter?" "This is a respectable position, the wages are generous, and the Duke of Ashcombe has treated me with nothing but—" "You do not understand." Mrs. Bramwell's eyes darted toward the doorway, where the Duke now stood watching the exchange with an expression carved from stone, giving away nothing. When her gaze landed on him fully, something in her face changed, a flicker of recognition and fear that she could not quite hide fast enough. "Your Grace." "Mrs. Bramwell." His voice was quiet, controlled, though Eleanor sensed a current running beneath it that had not been there a moment before. "It has been a long time." The room went utterly silent. Eleanor looked between the two of them, her confusion deepening into something closer to alarm. "You know each other?" "We have met," the Duke said carefully, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Bramwell's face. "Some years ago, in circumstances I have not forgotten, though I suspect Mrs. Bramwell hoped I might." Mrs. Bramwell's composure cracked further, her hands trembling now as she released Eleanor's fingers and clasped her own together instead, as though trying to hold herself steady. "I do not know what you believe you remember, Your Grace, but I assure you—" "I remember a great deal," the Duke interrupted, his voice still quiet, but carrying an edge now that made the hairs on Eleanor's arms rise. "I remember a promise made to a dying woman. I remember a child who vanished from her family's care under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained, and I remember the name of the woman entrusted with hiding that child away, far from the family who might have protected her." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Mrs. Bramwell, waiting for the denial that surely must come, the explanation that would make sense of these impossible words. But Mrs. Bramwell said nothing at all. She simply stood there, pale and trembling, her silence louder than any confession could have been. "Mrs. Bramwell," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what is he talking about?" "Eleanor, dear, please, we should speak of this privately, not here, not in front of—" "No." The word came out sharper than Eleanor intended, sharp enough that Mrs. Bramwell flinched. "You will tell me now. Is this true? Do you know something about my family that you have kept from me my entire life?" Mrs. Bramwell's eyes filled with tears, and for a long moment she seemed unable to speak at all. When she finally did, her voice was small and broken, nothing like the firm, practical woman who had raised Eleanor from childhood. "I did what I believed was right. I was told your safety depended on your obscurity, that if certain people knew who you truly were, you would be in grave danger. I have kept that promise for 21 years, Eleanor, at great cost to myself and, I see now, at great cost to you as well." "Who am I?" Eleanor's voice cracked on the question, years of unanswered wondering finally breaking through the careful composure she had built around herself. "Please, if you know anything, tell me now." Mrs. Bramwell looked past her, toward the Duke, as though seeking permission or perhaps forgiveness. "Your mother's name was Lady Catherine. She died when you were very young, and before her death, she made me promise to keep you hidden and safe from those who sought to take what belonged to you. I have watched you grow from a distance my whole life, telling myself I was protecting you, though I begin to wonder now if I simply prolonged a wound that should have healed long ago." The name struck Eleanor like a physical blow. Lady Catherine. The woman in the portrait, the one whose face had felt so strangely familiar, whose eyes seemed to hold a warmth Eleanor had somehow recognized without understanding why. She turned toward the Duke, searching his face for confirmation or denial, and found only a steady, aching certainty that told her everything Mrs. Bramwell's words had already suggested. "You knew," Eleanor said to him, her voice trembling now with a mixture of emotions she could not begin to untangle. "From the very first day, when I walked into your study, you already suspected who I was." "I suspected," he admitted quietly. "I did not know for certain, not until this moment. But yes, from the first day, I believed I had finally found the woman I had spent 3 years searching for on behalf of a promise I made to your mother before she died. And you said nothing. You let me believe I had simply found honest employment, while all along you were studying me, testing me, searching for proof." "I did not know how to tell you," he said, and for the first time since she had met him, his composure faltered, something raw and uncertain breaking through the careful mask he always wore. "I did not know if you would believe me, or if the shock of such news, delivered by a stranger, might do more harm than good. I wanted to be certain before I spoke, so that I would not offer you false hope only to see it crushed by error." Eleanor stepped back from both of them, her mind reeling, the small drawing room suddenly feeling far too small to contain the weight of everything she had just learned. Her mother had a name. Her mother had died protecting her, or believing she was protecting her, from some danger neither Mrs. Bramwell nor the Duke had yet fully explained. And the man she had been working beside for days, sharing quiet conversations with in candlelit corridors, had known, or at least suspected, exactly who she was from the very moment they met. "I need air," she said, and before either of them could stop her, she turned and fled the drawing room, through the long corridors, out through a side door into the rain-soaked gardens, uncaring that she wore no cloak against the storm. The rain soaked through her dress within moments, cold and sharp against her skin, but Eleanor barely felt it. She walked without direction, her mind consumed entirely by the revelations of the past few minutes, by the name Lady Catherine echoing over and over in her thoughts, by the memory of that portrait's gentle eyes now transformed into something achingly personal. Her mother. The woman who had died wanting nothing more than to keep her safe, who had trusted a friend to find her someday, to bring her home to whatever legacy had been stolen from her at birth. She did not hear the footsteps approaching until the Duke was nearly beside her, his own clothes soaked through, as he had followed her out into the storm without pause for his own comfort. He said nothing at first, simply matching her pace, allowing her the silence she needed, until finally she stopped walking altogether and turned to face him, rain streaming down both their faces. Why did you not tell me sooner? She demanded. Every conversation, every strange question, all of it was you circling closer to a truth you already suspected. And you let me remain ignorant of my own life. Because I was afraid, he said simply, the admission costing him something visible in the tightness of his jaw. Afraid that if I spoke too soon and was wrong, I would shatter whatever peace you had built for yourself over false hope. And afraid too, if I am honest, that if I was right, everything between us would change the moment you learned the truth. And I was not ready to lose what had begun to grow, however quietly, between the two of us these past days. Eleanor stared at him, rain dripping from her lashes, her heart aching with too many feelings at once to name clearly. Anger at the deception, however well-intentioned. Grief for a mother she had never truly known. And beneath it all, a confusing warmth toward this man who had searched for years, who had watched her with such careful intensity, who now stood before her in the storm admitting fears she had not expected a duke to ever confess aloud. I do not know what to feel, she admitted quietly. I do not know who I am anymore. If everything I believed about my own life was built on hidden truths. You are the same woman you were yesterday, he said, stepping closer, his voice low and earnest beneath the sound of the rain. A name does not change your mind, your kindness, your quick wit, or your courage. It only explains where you came from. Who you are, Eleanor, you have already shown me, every single day since you walked into my study. They stood together in the rain for what felt like a long while, neither speaking, until finally the Duke removed his coat and settled it carefully over her shoulders, insisting she return inside before she caught a chill. Eleanor allowed herself to be led back toward the house, her thoughts still spinning, though the warmth of his coat against her soaked dress offered a strange comfort she had not expected to feel from him. Mrs. Fairweather met them at the door, alarm written across her face at the sight of them both drenched to the skin, and hurried Eleanor away toward a guest chamber where a fire had already been lit, insisting she change into dry clothes before catching her death in the damp English air. Eleanor did not resist. She sat before the fire wrapped in a warm blanket, her mind still churning through everything that had happened, while a maid brought tea she barely touched. It was nearly an hour before Mrs. Bramwell found her there, hesitant in the doorway, her own eyes red from crying. "May I come in?" Eleanor nodded, though she could not quite bring herself to smile or offer any warmth in return. Mrs. Bramwell settled into the chair opposite her, twisting her hands together in her lap, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I owe you the whole truth," Mrs. Bramwell said finally, "not fragments delivered in a moment of panic, but everything I know, exactly as I promised your mother I would tell you when the time was right." "Then tell me," Eleanor said quietly. "I have waited 21 years. I do not wish to wait any longer." Mrs. Bramwell drew a steadying breath. "Your mother, Lady Catherine, was a dear friend of mine from our girlhood, long before either of us married. She fell gravely ill not long after you were born, and in her final months, she grew convinced that certain relations of your late father intended you harm, that they meant to see you removed from any claim to the inheritance and title that should rightfully have passed to you. She could not prove it, not with evidence a court would accept, but her fear was genuine, and I had never known her to frighten easily." "What sort of harm?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight. "I do not know the particulars, only that she feared for your safety enough to beg me, on her deathbed, to take you far from the family estate and raise you under a different name, in a place where no one would think to look for a lost heiress. I agreed because I loved her, and because I could see how deeply her fear had settled into her final days. I told myself I was protecting you. Perhaps I was. But I also see now that in protecting you from a danger I never fully understood, I denied you the chance to know your own history, your own mother's love, and I am deeply sorry for that." Eleanor absorbed this in silence, the fire crackling softly beside her, the rain still falling steadily outside the window. "And the Duke? How does he come to be involved in all of this?" "He was a close friend to your father, before your father's own death, and your mother trusted him above nearly anyone else. When she grew ill, she extracted a promise from him as well, that if I ever proved unable to protect you, or if circumstances changed, he would take up the search and see you restored to your rightful place. I did not know he had continued searching all these years. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that the matter had faded with time." "It did not fade for him," Eleanor said softly, thinking of the locked drawer, the wrapped portrait, the careful questions asked over quiet candlelit evenings. "He has been searching for 3 years, by his own account." "Then he has kept his promise more faithfully than I kept mine," Mrs. Bramwell said, her voice heavy with regret. "I only hope you can forgive me, Eleanor, for choosing silence over truth for so long. It was never my intention to cause you pain. I wanted only to keep you safe." Eleanor reached across the small space between them and took Mrs. Bramwell's hand, feeling the older woman's fingers tremble beneath her own. "I do not know yet how to feel about everything I have learned today, but I do not doubt that you loved me, and that you believed you were protecting me. That much, at least, I have never questioned." Mrs. Bramwell's eyes filled with fresh tears, and she pressed Eleanor's hand gratefully before rising to take her leave, promising to remain in the area for as long as Eleanor needed her, ready to answer whatever further questions arose in the days ahead. Once she had gone, Eleanor sat alone before the fire for a long while, watching the flames dance and turning over the strange, unsettling shape of her own history, now finally beginning to take form after 21 years of silence. 3 days passed before Eleanor felt steady enough to return fully to her duties in the study, and in that time the household around her seemed to shift in ways both subtle and profound. Mrs. Fairweather began addressing her with a new gentleness, the other maids offering small courtesies they had not extended before, as though word of her true identity had already begun to spread quietly through the servants' hall despite everyone's careful discretion. The Duke, for his part, treated her with the same courtesy as always, though something in his manner had softened, the careful distance he once maintained now replaced by an openness that felt both welcome and unsettling. He found her one afternoon in the library, curled into a window seat with a book she had not truly been reading, her mind still far too occupied with the weight of everything Mrs. Bramwell had confessed. He paused in the doorway, hesitant in a way she had never seen from him before, and asked if he might join her. "Of course," she said, setting the book aside. He settled into a chair nearby, though he did not speak immediately, seeming to gather his thoughts before finally breaking the silence. "I have written to my solicitor regarding the matter of your inheritance. There are records that must be examined, witnesses who may need to testify to confirm your identity beyond doubt, though I do not believe there will be serious difficulty, given the mark upon your wrist matches precisely the description your mother provided before her death." Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to cover the crescent-shaped mark beneath her sleeve, still adjusting to the strange reality that this small, private feature of her body had become evidence in a legal matter concerning her entire future. "And if the inheritance is confirmed, what becomes of me then?" "You would take your rightful place as heiress to your father's estate and title, separate from mine, though the properties border each other along the eastern boundary. You would have wealth, land, and a name that carries respect throughout the county, everything that was meant to be yours from birth." "It feels strange," she admitted, "to hear my future described in such certain terms, when only days ago I believed myself to be nothing more than a secretary earning honest wages." "You were never nothing," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Heiress or secretary, your worth was never determined by a title, Eleanor. I want you to understand that clearly, whatever the solicitors eventually confirm." She looked at him then, searching his face for the meaning behind his words, and found only sincerity there, steady and unguarded in a way that made her chest tighten with feelings she had not yet found the courage to examine closely. "Thank you," she said softly, "for searching so long, for keeping a promise most men would have abandoned after the first year without success." "I made a vow to a dying woman I respected greatly," he said. "But I will confess, these past days have shown me another reason to be glad the search finally ended as it did." Something in his tone made her breath catch, and for a moment the space between them felt charged with unspoken things neither of them was quite ready to name aloud. But before either could say more, a knock sounded at the library door, and a footman entered to announce that Mrs. Bramwell had returned once more, this time accompanied by an unfamiliar gentleman who insisted on speaking with the Duke immediately regarding, as he put it, a matter of grave importance concerning Miss Winslow's true parentage. The Duke's expression shifted instantly into something guarded and alert. "Send them to the drawing room. I will join them shortly." Eleanor rose as well, her earlier warmth replaced by a returning unease. Who could this be? "I do not know," the Duke admitted, "but I do not care for unexpected visitors who arrive claiming urgent knowledge of matters so carefully guarded until now. Come, it is better we face this together than for you to wait here wondering." They found the stranger waiting in the drawing room alongside Mrs. Bramwell, a thin, sharp-featured man dressed in the plain, respectable clothing of a solicitor's clerk, his expression carrying the particular wariness of a man who knew he carried unwelcome news. He introduced himself as Mr. Godfrey Ashworth, employed for many years by the very family who had once served as trustees over the late Lady Catherine's estate, and explained that he had come upon learning, through channels he preferred not to specify, that inquiries had recently been made regarding a lost heiress matching Eleanor's description. "I must warn you both," he said, glancing nervously between the Duke and Eleanor, "that certain parties will not welcome this discovery. The estate in question has been managed for 21 years by relations who believe the true heiress lost or dead. They have grown accustomed to the income and authority such management provides, and I fear they will not relinquish it without considerable resistance." "What sort of resistance?" the Duke asked, his voice sharpening. "Legal challenges, certainly, disputing the validity of any evidence you present. But I have also heard whispers, Your Grace, of intentions less honorable than mere paperwork. The family in question has much to lose, and desperate men have been known to take desperate measures when their comfortable lives are threatened." Eleanor felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the drawing room's temperature. "Are you suggesting I may be in actual danger?" Mr. Ashworth hesitated, clearly reluctant to alarm her further, but ultimately nodded gravely. "I would not have traveled here in such haste otherwise, Miss Winslow. I believe your safety, and perhaps your very life, may depend on how carefully the coming weeks are managed." The Duke's jaw tightened, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression, the careful composure giving way to a protective intensity that startled her with its immediacy. "She will remain here, under my protection, until every matter of her inheritance is settled beyond any doubt or challenge. I will not have her exposed to danger after searching so long to find her safe." "A wise precaution, Your Grace," Mr. Ashworth agreed, "though I would also advise discretion. The fewer who know of her whereabouts and true identity in these early days, the safer she will remain while the legal foundations are properly established." Mrs. Bramwell, who had remained largely silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice trembling with a fear Eleanor recognized as genuine. "This is precisely what I feared all those years ago, when Lady Catherine first begged me to hide her away. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that so much time might have softened whatever threat originally drove her to such desperate measures. Some threats do not soften with time," the Duke said grimly. "They merely wait, patient and hidden, for the moment their target resurfaces." Eleanor looked around the room at the three anxious faces surrounding her, and felt, for the first time since learning her true identity, the full weight of what it meant to be an heiress whose very existence threatened the comfortable position of others. It was not simply a matter of reclaiming a name and a fortune. It was a matter of survival, of navigating a world of hidden enemies she had never known existed, all because a will and a birthright had marked her, from infancy, as someone whose presence certain people would rather erase entirely. "What must I do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "For now," the Duke said, "you remain here, where I can ensure your safety personally. Mr. Ashworth will gather the necessary documentation quietly, without alerting those who might interfere. And we will proceed with caution, verifying every detail before we make any public claim regarding your identity." Mr. Ashworth nodded his agreement, gathering his papers to take his leave, promising to return within the fortnight with whatever records he could safely obtain. Mrs. Bramwell lingered a moment longer, embracing Eleanor tightly before she too departed, promising to remain nearby should she be needed. Once the visitors had gone, Eleanor found herself alone with the Duke in the quiet drawing room, the weight of the afternoon's revelations settling heavily over them both. "You did not tell me there might be danger involved in reclaiming what was taken from me," she said quietly. "I did not know the extent of it myself, not until today," he admitted. "Had I understood sooner, I might have proceeded more carefully from the very beginning, though I confess I am not certain what I would have done differently. I could not have left you unaware of your identity forever, whatever risks the truth might carry." "No," she agreed. "I would not have wished for that either, whatever the cost." He crossed the room slowly and took her hand in his, the gesture unexpected but not unwelcome. "I promise you, Eleanor, whatever comes next, you will not face it alone. I searched 3 years to find you. I do not intend to lose you now, to danger or to anything else, when I have only just begun to know the woman you truly are." Eleanor looked up at him, her heart racing with a confusing mixture of fear and something warmer, something she had not expected to feel so soon after learning her entire life had been built upon hidden truths. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing beside me through all of this, even before you knew for certain who I was." "I would stand beside you," he said softly, "whoever you turned out to be." Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance between them, though the air felt charged with the possibility of it, a quiet understanding passing between them that went beyond words. Outside, the rain had finally begun to clear, pale afternoon light breaking through the clouds and spilling across the drawing room floor, as though even the weather understood that something important had shifted between them, fragile and new, in the midst of all the danger and uncertainty still to come. That evening, the Duke summoned 2 additional footmen to stand watch near the family wing through the night, a precaution Eleanor found both reassuring and faintly alarming, a reminder that the danger Mr. Ashworth had warned of was not merely theoretical. She dined alone with the Duke that night, the long table between them feeling smaller somehow than it had on previous evenings, conversation flowing more easily now that so much lay openly between them, rather than hidden beneath careful questions and guarded answers. "Tell me of your father," Eleanor asked, as the last course was cleared away. "You knew him, I understand, before his death." The Duke's expression softened with memory. He was a good man, quick to laugh, generous with his tenants in a way not every landowner troubles himself to be. "He and I were close as young men, before either of us inherited our respective titles. When he married your mother, I stood beside him at the ceremony, though I confess I do not remember much of the day beyond how happy he seemed." "What happened to him?" "A fever took him swiftly, before you were even born. Your mother carried you into the world already a widow, which I believe made her all the more determined to protect whatever legacy remained for you, even at great personal cost." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I do not believe the danger Mr. Ashworth spoke of stems from any fault of your father's. I suspect it lies instead with relations eager to claim what should never have been theirs, men who saw an infant heiress and a grieving widow as an opportunity rather than a family to protect." Eleanor absorbed this quietly, feeling the shape of her own history grow fuller with each detail, painful as some of it proved to be. "I wish I had known them both, my mother, my father. It feels strange to grieve people I cannot even properly remember." "Grief does not require memory," the Duke said gently. "Only love, and the knowledge of what was lost. You may grieve them fully, Eleanor, whatever the shape of your memories." They sat together a while longer after the meal concluded, the conversation drifting into quieter, gentler territory, stories of the Duke's own childhood, memories of Lady Catherine's kindness as recalled by those who had known her, small details that helped Eleanor build, piece by piece, a fuller picture of the family she had never known she possessed. By the time she finally retired to her chamber, the fear stirred by Mr. Ashworth's warnings had not vanished entirely, but it had settled into something more manageable, tempered by the steady presence of the man who had promised to stand beside her through whatever came next. She lay awake for a while, listening to the quiet sounds of the great house settling around her, the distant murmur of footmen keeping their watch, and found herself thinking not of danger, but of the warmth in the Duke's eyes when he had taken her hand that afternoon, and the strange, hopeful ache that warmth had left behind in her chest. A fortnight passed in careful, watchful quiet, and true to his word, Mr. Ashworth returned bearing documents that confirmed, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Eleanor Winslow was in truth Eleanor Harrington, only daughter of the late Lord Harrington and Lady Catherine, rightful heiress to an estate that had, for 21 years, been managed by her father's distant cousin, a man named Cornelius Harrington, in trust for an heiress everyone had long assumed dead or permanently lost. The confirmation should have brought relief, but instead it brought a fresh wave of tension through Ashcombe Hall, as the Duke moved swiftly to prepare for the legal proceedings that would formally restore Eleanor to her name and inheritance, while simultaneously arranging additional protections against whatever response Cornelius Harrington might mount upon learning his comfortable arrangement faced sudden and permanent disruption. Eleanor spent those weeks caught between hope and dread, her days filled with meetings alongside solicitors and quiet conversations with the Duke about what her new life might look like once everything was settled. Their relationship had deepened steadily in that time, quiet dinners extending into long conversations by the fire, careful hands brushing during shared work in the study, glances held a moment longer than strict propriety required. Eleanor found herself falling for him slowly and completely, though she had not yet found the courage to name the feeling aloud, uncertain whether what grew between them was genuine, or simply the natural closeness born of shared crisis and dependency. It was this very uncertainty that troubled her most as the day approached when the Duke intended to formally present her claim before the appropriate authorities, and it came to a painful head one evening when she overheard, quite by accident, a conversation she was never meant to hear at all. She had gone in search of the Duke to discuss a matter concerning the following day's proceedings, and finding the study empty, made her way toward his private chambers, only to hear his voice through a partially open door, speaking to Mr. Ashworth in tones far more candid than any she had heard from him before. "The inheritance alone would secure her future beyond any question," the Duke was saying, "but I confess, I have grown attached to more than simply completing my promise to her mother. I find myself hoping, Ashworth, that once this matter is settled, she might consider remaining here. as more than a secretary or a grateful ward under my protection. You mean to court her, your grace? I mean to marry her, if she will have me, once she is settled into her rightful place and free to choose her own future without any sense of obligation toward the man who found her. Eleanor's breath caught, her heart lifting with a sudden, dizzying joy. But before she could process the feeling fully, Mr. Ashworth's next words struck her with the force of cold water. Forgive my bluntness, your grace, but you must consider how such a match might appear to others, and indeed to Miss Winslow herself, once she reflects upon it fully. You searched for an heiress for 3 years on behalf of a promise to her mother, found her working unknowingly beneath your own roof, and now intend to marry her, uniting her inheritance with your own considerable estate. Some might say, unkindly perhaps, that you have arranged matters rather conveniently in your own favor. That is not my intention at all, the Duke said sharply. I do not doubt your sincerity, your grace, but intention and appearance are not always the same thing, and Miss Winslow has already endured a great deal of deception in her young life. She may find it difficult to trust that your affection is entirely separate from the fortune and title she now stands to inherit, particularly given how the two have become so thoroughly entangled from the very beginning of your acquaintance. Eleanor did not wait to hear the Duke's response. She turned and fled down the corridor, her mind reeling with confusion and hurt, Mr. Ashworth's words echoing through her thoughts with painful clarity. She had believed the warmth growing between them was genuine, something real and separate from the strange circumstances of their meeting. But now, hearing it discussed so plainly, reduced to matters of appearance and convenient arrangement, she found herself doubting everything, wondering if what she had felt was simply gratitude mistaken for something deeper, and whether his own feelings were as pure as they had seemed, or tangled inescapably with the promise he had made and the estate he stood to see joined with his own. She did not sleep that night, and by morning she had resolved to speak with him directly. Unable to bear the uncertainty a moment longer, she found him in the study, already at work, and closed the door firmly behind her, before he could offer his usual morning greeting. I overheard you last night, she said without preamble, speaking with Mr. Ashworth about your intentions toward me. The Duke set down his pen slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to something more guarded. Eleanor, whatever you heard, I assure you my feelings for you are genuine, entirely separate from— Are they? She interrupted, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain composed. Because from where I stood, it sounded very much as though even Mr. Ashworth questioned whether your affection could be untangled from the fortune and title you have spent 3 years searching to restore to me. How am I to know the difference myself, when everything between us began with you searching for an heiress, not a woman? I began searching for a promise, he said, rising from his desk, his own voice sharpening with something like desperation. But I did not fall for a fortune, Eleanor. I fell for the way you challenge me, the way you work until the candles burn low because you refuse to leave a task unfinished, the way you asked after a portrait's story instead of simply admiring its beauty. None of that has anything to do with your inheritance. But you cannot separate the two so easily, can you? Every conversation we have shared, every quiet dinner, every moment I believed was building something real between us, all of it happened while you already knew, or at least suspected, that I stood to inherit a fortune that borders your own estate. How am I to trust that your heart was ever truly free in this, when so much has been arranged and entangled from the very start? Because I am telling you the truth, he said, crossing the room to stand before her, his eyes earnest and pained. I searched for you because I made a promise to a dying woman. I fell for you because of who you are, not what you stand to inherit. Those are two separate truths, Eleanor, and I will not apologize for the first simply because it complicates the second. Eleanor felt tears gathering despite her effort to hold them back. I do not know how to believe you, not when even your own solicitor questions whether such a thing is possible. I have spent my entire life uncertain of who I truly am, and now, just as I begin to learn the truth of my birth, I find myself equally uncertain of the truth of your heart. I cannot build a future on that kind of doubt. Then let me prove it to you, he said, his voice low and urgent. Give me time, Eleanor. Let your inheritance be settled fully, separate from any question of marriage or courtship. Let us wait until you are established in your own right, secure and independent, owing nothing to me, before either of us speaks again of anything beyond friendship. If what grows between us then is still real, still strong, you will know it has nothing to do with gratitude or convenience, because you will have already claimed your own place in the world without needing me at all. Eleanor considered his words carefully, torn between the ache of wanting to believe him completely and the wound of doubt that Mr. Ashworth's careless words had opened within her. And if, once I am settled, I decide I do not wish to pursue anything further between us at all? Then I will accept that decision, he said, though something in his eyes told her the words cost him greatly to speak. I will not press you toward a future you do not want, whatever my own hopes might be. You have spent your whole life having choices made for you by others, Eleanor. I will not become another voice deciding your fate without your full and willing consent. The tension between them remained unresolved even after their conversation ended, Eleanor retreating to her chamber to compose herself before the day's legal proceedings began, the Duke remaining in his study with a weight visible in his shoulders that had not been there before. Neither of them spoke further of the matter that day, both maintaining careful, professional distance as the solicitors arrived and the formal process of restoring Eleanor's identity moved forward, papers signed, testimonies recorded, the machinery of law grinding slowly but surely toward the moment when Eleanor Winslow would formally become Eleanor Harrington, heiress in her own right. But even as the proceedings advanced, word had already begun to travel beyond the walls of Ashcombe Hall, carried by clerks and witnesses who could not resist sharing such remarkable news, and by that evening, a messenger arrived bearing a letter addressed to Eleanor, in an unfamiliar hand, sealed with wax stamped in a crest she did not recognize, though something about it made her stomach turn cold with instinctive dread even before she broke the seal to read the words within. She read the letter alone in her chamber, her hands growing unsteady with each line. It came from Cornelius Harrington himself, written in a tone that began with false courtesy, and quickly turned cold and threatening beneath its polished words. He congratulated her on her sudden discovery of identity, though the congratulations dripped with contempt rather than warmth, and went on to suggest, in language careful enough to avoid outright accusation, that a young woman raised in obscurity, with no proof beyond a birthmark and the word of a duke eager to see his own estate joined with hers, ought to consider carefully whether pursuing such a public claim was truly in her best interest. The letter closed with a warning that certain matters, once set into motion, could not always be controlled by those who began them, and that he hoped, for her sake, she would reconsider before matters grew more difficult than she could manage. Eleanor sat frozen for a long moment after finishing the letter, fear and anger warring within her chest. She thought of Mr. Ashworth's earlier warnings, of the Duke's insistence on additional footmen standing watch through the night, and understood now, with sudden clarity, that the danger she had been told of was no longer distant or theoretical. It had arrived at her very door, wrapped in careful, threatening words. She carried the letter to the Duke's study, finding him still at his desk despite the late hour, and set it before him without a word. He read it quickly, his expression darkening with each line, and when he finished, his hand closed around the parchment with barely restrained anger. He does not frighten easily deterred women with idle threats, the Duke said grimly. This confirms what Ashworth feared. Harrington intends to fight this by whatever means necessary, and I fear legal challenges may only be the beginning of his efforts. What do we do? Eleanor asked, her earlier hurt from their conversation that morning momentarily forgotten beneath the more immediate fear the letter had stirred within her. We proceed with even greater caution, the Duke said, and we ensure you are never left unguarded, not for a single moment, until this matter is fully and legally resolved beyond any possibility of challenge. I will also send word to the local magistrate, informing him of this letter, so that any further threats Harrington makes will already be documented should matters escalate further. Eleanor nodded, though the fear had settled deep into her chest, cold and persistent. I did not expect reclaiming my own name would place me in such danger. I am sorry for it, the Duke said, his voice softening despite the tension of the moment. Whatever remains unresolved between us, Eleanor, know that your safety matters to me above all else. I will not allow Harrington or anyone else to harm you, whatever it costs me to prevent it. She looked at him for a long moment, the earlier doubt Mr. Ashworth's words had planted still lingering somewhere beneath her fear, though it felt smaller now, less significant, against the immediate reality of the threat they now faced together. Thank you, she said quietly, for taking this seriously, and for standing beside me despite everything unsettled between us this morning. I would stand beside you regardless, he said. That much at least, you may trust completely, whatever else remains uncertain. The following days brought increased vigilance throughout Ashcombe Hall, additional footmen stationed at every entrance, Eleanor's movements carefully tracked and accompanied whenever she left the safety of the family wing. The legal proceedings continued despite the mounting tension, witnesses called, documents verified, the slow machinery of the courts grinding steadily toward a resolution that could not come soon enough for Eleanor's fraying nerves. She and the Duke maintained a careful, professional distance in the wake of their earlier conversation, though the warmth between them had not entirely vanished. surfacing in small moments. A steadying hand offered during a difficult meeting, a shared glance of relief when another piece of evidence fell favorably into place. Then, on the evening before the final hearing that would formally confirm Eleanor's inheritance, a disturbance in the stables drew the household's attention. Shouts and the frantic whinnying of frightened horses cutting through the quiet night air. Eleanor rushed toward the sound alongside several footmen, only to find that someone had attempted to set fire to the stable's western wall. A clumsy but dangerous act quickly discovered and extinguished before serious harm could be done, though the message behind it was impossible to mistake. "Harrington grows desperate," the Duke said grimly, surveying the scorched wall in the torchlight, his jaw tight with barely controlled fury. "This was meant to frighten you, Eleanor, perhaps to convince you the danger of pursuing your claim outweighs whatever you stand to gain." "It will not work," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "I have spent 21 years living a life that was never truly my own. I will not surrender my rightful name now, not to fire, not to threats, not to anything Cornelius Harrington believes he can frighten me into abandoning." The Duke looked at her with something like fierce pride shining in his eyes despite the tension of the moment. "Then we proceed tomorrow as planned, and we ensure Harrington understands, once and for all, that his schemes will not succeed against you." That night, Eleanor found sleep impossible, her mind circling endlessly between fear of what tomorrow's hearing might bring and the lingering ache of uncertainty that Mr. Ashworth's words had planted regarding the Duke's true feelings. She rose before dawn and made her way to the study, finding it empty at that early hour, and sat for a long while at the desk where she had first begun her work in this house, running her fingers over the familiar grain of the wood, trying to steady her racing thoughts before the day ahead. The Duke found her there as the first gray light of morning crept through the windows, and rather than speaking immediately, he simply sat beside her in comfortable silence, offering his presence without demanding conversation she did not yet have the strength to give. It was, she realized, exactly what she needed in that moment, and something in his quiet patience eased a measure of the fear knotted tight within her chest. "Whatever happens today," she said finally, "I want you to know that I do not regret coming to Ashcombe Hall, whatever complications it has brought into my life." "Nor do I regret placing that advertisement," he said softly, "though I confess I never imagined it would lead to a fire in my stables and threats delivered by messenger. Still, I would endure it all again, Eleanor, simply for the chance to have found you at last." She allowed herself, for the first time since overhearing his conversation with Mr. Ashworth, to believe fully in the sincerity behind his words, the doubt that had lingered these past days finally beginning to loosen its grip upon her heart, even as the uncertain trial of the coming hearing stretched before them both like a shadow neither could yet see beyond. The hearing convened at midday in the county courthouse, a somber stone building that seemed to press down upon Eleanor's already frayed nerves the moment she stepped through its heavy doors. She wore a gown the Duke had insisted be prepared for her, dark green and finely tailored, nothing like the plain gray dresses she had worn her whole life, and though she felt strange in such fine clothing, she understood the necessity of appearing every inch the heiress she had been proven to be. Mr. Ashworth stood ready with his documentation. Witnesses called forward one by one to testify to the details of Lady Catherine's final months, the promise extracted from Mrs. Bramwell and the Duke, the careful hiding of a child whose safety her mother had feared for above all else. Mrs. Bramwell herself testified with tears in her eyes, recounting the years of careful secrecy, the birthmarks she had watched over since Eleanor's infancy, the promise she had finally broken her silence to fulfill. Cornelius Harrington arrived partway through the proceedings, flanked by his own solicitor, his expression carrying a cold fury he made little effort to disguise. He challenged the evidence at every turn, questioning the reliability of a birthmark as proof, suggesting Mrs. Bramwell's testimony might be motivated by financial gain rather than genuine truth, and implying, with careful insinuation, that the Duke's involvement suggested a scheme designed to benefit his own estate through convenient marriage, rather than honest restoration of a lost heiress's rights. "Your Honor," the Duke said, rising to address the magistrate directly, his voice carrying steady authority through the courtroom, "I would remind the court that I stand to gain nothing from this proceeding beyond the satisfaction of fulfilling a promise made to a dying woman I respected greatly. Miss Winslow's inheritance remains entirely separate from my own estate, and any suggestion of intended marriage exists nowhere but in Mr. Harrington's own imagination, offered here only to distract from the overwhelming evidence supporting her rightful claim." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at his words, though she kept her composure, watching as the magistrate reviewed the documentation before him with careful, measured attention. The birthmark was examined and compared against the description recorded in Lady Catherine's own hand years before her death. Testimony was weighed. Records of Eleanor's birth, carefully preserved by Mrs. Bramwell despite the risks of doing so, were presented and confirmed by an independent clerk unconnected to either party. At one point, Harrington's solicitor called forward a physician he claimed could dispute the significance of the birthmark entirely, suggesting such marks were common enough among the general population to prove nothing conclusive on their own. The Duke's own solicitor countered swiftly, presenting a sealed letter written by Lady Catherine herself in the final weeks of her illness, describing not only the mark but the precise circumstances of Eleanor's early childhood, details that matched Mrs. Bramwell's testimony so exactly that even Harrington's solicitor seemed to lose confidence in pressing the challenge further. Eleanor sat through it all with her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the careful dismantling of every objection Harrington's side attempted to raise, and found herself grateful beyond words for the Duke's foresight in gathering such thorough evidence over the preceding weeks. Each witness called, each document presented, felt like another brick laid beneath a foundation she had never known she possessed, building steadily toward a version of herself she was only now beginning to fully understand. The proceedings stretched through the afternoon, tension mounting with each new piece of evidence presented, Harrington's objections growing increasingly desperate as the case against his continued management of the estate grew undeniable. At last, as the light outside the tall courthouse windows began to soften toward evening, the magistrate called for silence and delivered his judgment. Having reviewed all evidence presented before this court, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. I find the claim of Eleanor Harrington, formerly known as Eleanor Winslow, to be established beyond reasonable doubt. The birthmark matches precisely the description recorded by her late mother. The testimony of Mrs. Constance Bramwell, corroborated by independent records of birth, confirms the circumstances of her hidden upbringing. This court therefore formally restores to Eleanor Harrington the full inheritance, title, and property rightfully belonging to her by birth, effective immediately. A murmur swept through the courtroom, and Eleanor felt tears spring unbidden to her eyes, 21 years of uncertainty finally resolving into this single definitive moment. She looked toward the Duke, who watched her with an expression of such open joy and relief that she found herself smiling despite the tears still gathering on her lashes. Cornelius Harrington's face had gone pale with fury, and as the courtroom began to empty, he approached Eleanor directly, his solicitor trailing anxiously behind him, clearly uncertain how to contain his client's obvious anger. You believe this ends the matter, Harrington said quietly, his voice low enough that only Eleanor and the Duke standing protectively beside her could hear. You are mistaken. I have managed that estate for 21 years. I will not simply hand it over because a magistrate believes a birthmark and an old woman's tears. The court has ruled, the Duke said, stepping between them with quiet but unmistakable authority. I would advise you to accept that ruling gracefully, Harrington, rather than pursue further action that will only cost you more than you have already lost this day. Harrington's eyes narrowed, but something in the Duke's steady, unflinching gaze seemed to give him pause. After a long, tense moment, he turned without another word and strode from the courthouse, his solicitor hurrying to keep pace behind him. Eleanor watched him go, uncertain whether the threat had truly passed or merely retreated to regroup for some future confrontation. But the immediate relief of the magistrate's ruling outweighed, for the moment, any lingering fear of what might come next. It is done, she said softly, still hardly able to believe the words as she spoke them. I am truly Eleanor Harrington now, in the eyes of the law and everyone else. You have always been Eleanor Harrington, the Duke said gently. Today the world simply caught up to what was always true. They returned to Ashcombe Hall in the Duke's carriage, the evening settling gold and soft over the countryside as they traveled. And for the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt something like peace settle over her, the immediate danger of the legal challenge resolved, her identity finally and permanently secured. But as the carriage rolled up the familiar drive toward the great house, she found her thoughts returning, unbidden, to the conversation she and the Duke had left unresolved days earlier. The doubt Mr. Ashworth's words had planted still lingering somewhere beneath the relief of the day's victory. That evening, after a quiet celebratory dinner shared with Mrs. Bramwell and Mr. Ashworth, both of whom departed soon after to allow Eleanor and the Duke a measure of privacy, Eleanor found herself once more in the drawing room, where, weeks earlier, her entire world had shifted with Mrs. Bramwell's tearful confession. The Duke joined her there, standing near the cold hearth much as Mrs. Bramwell once had, his expression thoughtful and slightly uncertain in a way she rarely saw from him. You are truly free now, he said, independent, secure in your own right, owing nothing to me or to anyone else for your position in the world, just as I promised when we spoke of waiting." "Yes," Eleanor agreed softly. "I suppose I am. Then I find myself in the position of asking you a question I have wanted to ask, since long before today's hearing, though I promised myself I would wait until you stood exactly where you stand now, free to answer however your heart truly desires, without any shadow of obligation or gratitude clouding your decision." Eleanor's heart began to race, though she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I love you, Eleanor," he said simply, the words carrying none of the careful formality she had come to expect from him, only quiet, earnest truth. "Not because you are an heiress, not because finding you fulfilled a promise I made years ago, but because of who you are, plainly and completely. The woman who challenged me across a desk covered in ledgers, who wandered a gallery at midnight because a portrait's eyes felt familiar, who faced down threats and fire without once considering abandoning what was rightfully hers. I have loved you for weeks now, and I find I can no longer keep that truth to myself, whatever the risk of speaking it aloud." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes once more, though these carried none of the fear or grief of recent weeks, only overwhelming warmth. "I was afraid," she admitted, "that what I felt for you might simply be gratitude, mistaken for something deeper. Mr. Ashworth's words troubled me more than I let you know." "And now?" he asked gently. "Do you still fear that?" "No," she said, crossing the small distance between them, her heart finally settling into a certainty she had been too afraid to claim before. "I do not fear it any longer, because I chose to come find you tonight, in this room, of my own free will, needing nothing from you beyond the truth of your heart. And I find, standing here, secure in my own name and my own fortune, that what I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude at all. I love you too, Nathaniel, plainly and completely, exactly as you have just described." He reached for her hand, and this time neither of them hesitated, the distance between them closing at last as he drew her gently into his arms, the warmth of his embrace carrying none of the uncertainty that had lingered between them for so many anxious weeks. When he finally kissed her, softly and with a tenderness that spoke more clearly than any words could have managed, Eleanor felt, for the first time in her entire life, that she had found not only her true name and her rightful inheritance, but something even more precious, a place where she truly belonged, chosen freely and loved completely, for exactly who she was. In the weeks that followed their engagement, Eleanor traveled at last to see her father's estate with her own eyes. The grand house she had never known was rightfully hers, standing tall and dignified at the end of a long avenue of oak trees, much like Ashcombe Hall itself, though smaller and, she thought, somehow gentler in its proportions. She walked through rooms that had once belonged to her parents, touched furniture her mother had chosen, stood in a nursery that had briefly held her as an infant, before circumstances tore her away from everything she should have known. It was a strange, aching experience, grief and joy tangled together in equal measure, but the Duke remained steadily at her side throughout, allowing her the space to feel whatever she needed to feel, without rushing her through the process of reclaiming her own history. Mrs. Bramwell visited often in those weeks, gradually rebuilding the trust that had frayed under the weight of so many years of hidden truth. Eleanor found, to her own surprise, that forgiveness came more easily than she expected, once she understood fully the fear that had driven Mrs. Bramwell's silence, and the genuine love that had guided every difficult choice the older woman made on her behalf. They spent long afternoons together, sorting through old letters and belongings recovered from the estate, Mrs. Bramwell sharing stories of Lady Catherine's kindness and wit that helped Eleanor feel, for the first time, a genuine connection to the mother she had never truly known. They were married within the season, a quiet ceremony attended by Mrs. Bramwell, who wept through the entire service with joy rather than grief, and by Mr. Ashworth, who had become something of a family friend through the long weeks of legal proceedings. Cornelius Harrington made no further attempts to challenge Eleanor's inheritance, apparently satisfied that further resistance would cost him more than he could bear to lose, and in time the two estates, though never formally joined, worked together under the careful management of a duke and duchess who had found each other through the strangest of circumstances, a search born of a dying woman's promise, and a secretary's position that had, in the end, led not simply to a fortune reclaimed, but to a love neither of them had expected to find, hidden in plain sight all along. On the morning of the wedding itself, Eleanor stood before a tall mirror in her old chamber at Ashcombe Hall, dressed in pale ivory silk rather than the plain gray she had once considered her finest, and found herself remembering the frightened young woman who had first climbed into a carriage bound for this very house, certain of nothing beyond her own determination to prove herself worthy of an ordinary secretarial position. She could not have imagined then how thoroughly her life would transform, how completely the truth of her birth would reshape everything she believed about herself. Mrs. Bramwell fastened the final clasp of her gown with trembling hands, tears standing bright in her eyes. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Eleanor, not simply for reclaiming what was yours, but for the strength you have shown throughout, and the love you have found along the way." "I could not have found any of it without you," Eleanor said, embracing the woman who had raised her through every difficult year. "Whatever secrets had once stood between them, whatever mistakes were made, you kept me safe when it mattered most, and I will always be grateful for that." The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur of joy, vows spoken before a small gathering of friends and household staff who had watched Eleanor's transformation with genuine affection, the Duke's steady voice promising his devotion with the same quiet sincerity he had shown her from the very beginning of their acquaintance, however complicated that beginning had proven to be. Eleanor often thought, in the quiet years that followed, of that first day walking into the Duke's study, nervous and uncertain, believing herself simply a woman seeking honest employment. She had found so much more than a position that day, though she had not understood it then. She had found her name, her history, her courage tested and proven true, and a love built not upon fortune or obligation, but upon the simple, steady truth of two people who had recognized something real in each other, long before either fully understood what it meant. It was, she often reflected, exactly the kind of ending her mother would have wanted for her, a life reclaimed fully, and a heart given freely, at last, to someone worthy of it. A year had passed since Eleanor became Duchess of Ashcombe, and the estate she had inherited from her father now flourished under careful attention, its tenant farms restored to health, its accounts finally free of the quiet mismanagement Cornelius Harrington had allowed to accumulate over 2 decades of careless stewardship. Eleanor visited the property often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Nathaniel at her side, walking the fields her father had once walked, speaking with tenants who remembered her mother fondly, and who now watched her own steady leadership with growing respect and warmth. It was during one such visit, on a bright autumn morning with the leaves just beginning to turn gold along the long avenue of oaks, that a carriage arrived unannounced bearing a visitor Eleanor had not expected to see again. She recognized the crest before the carriage door even opened, and felt her stomach tighten with old wariness as Cornelius Harrington himself stepped down onto the gravel drive, considerably thinner and grayer than she remembered from the courthouse a year before. She met him in the front hall rather than inviting him further into the house, her guard raised instinctively despite the year of peace that had passed since his final threats. "Mr. Harrington, I confess I did not expect to see you here again." "I have not come to cause trouble, Your Grace," he said, and something in his voice carried a weariness she had not heard from him before, all the sharp fury of their earlier encounters worn away by time into something closer to regret. "I have come, in truth, to apologize, though I understand if you find such an apology difficult to accept after everything I attempted against you." Eleanor studied him carefully, uncertain whether to trust the change in his demeanor. "What has brought about this shift, if I may ask?" "Age, perhaps." "Illness, certainly, which tends to clarify a man's priorities rather sharply." He gestured vaguely toward his own thin frame. "The physicians do not expect me to see many more winters, Your Grace, and I find myself unwilling to leave this world without setting right what I can of the wrongs I committed against you and your mother's memory. I acted from greed and fear of losing the comfortable life I had built managing an estate that was never truly mine to claim. It was wrong of me, and I am sorry for the fire, for the threats, for every attempt I made to frighten you away from what was rightfully yours." Eleanor felt her guarded posture ease slightly, though old caution remained. "Thank you for saying so. I will not pretend the past year has been free of lingering unease regarding what you might still attempt, but I am glad to hear you have found some measure of peace with the truth." "There is one more matter," Harrington continued, reaching into his coat to produce a small, worn wooden box. "Among the estate records I managed all these years, I discovered this, tucked away and forgotten, likely overlooked during the original transfer of management after your mother's death. I believe it belongs to you now, more than it ever belonged to me." Eleanor accepted the box with careful hands and opened it to find a collection of letters, yellowed with age, tied together with a faded ribbon. The handwriting on the topmost letter was unfamiliar, elegant and flowing, and as she read the opening lines, her breath caught sharply in her throat. They were letters from her mother, written to her father during their courtship, long before Eleanor's birth, full of warmth and hope and the kind of tender affection Eleanor had never had the chance to witness firsthand. "I do not know why I kept them all these years," Harrington admitted. "Perhaps some part of me always knew they did not belong to me, and could not bring myself to destroy something so clearly precious, even as I worked against the very woman who should have inherited them. Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes as she carefully closed the box, holding it against her chest as though it might somehow vanish if she loosened her grip. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. This means more to me than you can possibly know." He nodded, something like genuine relief crossing his weathered features. "I will trouble you no further, Your Grace. I wished only to make what small amends remained within my power before it was too late to offer them at all." He departed soon after, and Eleanor stood alone in the front hall for a long while, turning the wooden box over in her hands, before finally carrying it to the small study she had claimed as her own within her father's house, settling into a chair beside the window to read her mother's letters properly, one by one, in the quiet golden light of the autumn afternoon. The letters revealed a woman Eleanor had never fully known, funny and quick-witted, deeply in love with the man who would become Eleanor's father, full of dreams for the family she hoped to build. One letter, written not long before her marriage, spoke of her hope for children someday, and the fierce love she already felt for the family she had not yet begun. Reading her mother's own words, in her mother's own hand, gave Eleanor a connection to her past that no portrait or second-hand story had ever fully provided, and she found herself both laughing and weeping as she made her way through the small collection, feeling, for the first time, as though she truly knew the woman who had loved her enough to risk everything for her safety. When Nathaniel found her there hours later, the letters spread carefully across the small writing desk. He did not interrupt immediately, simply watching from the doorway with quiet affection, until she finally looked up and beckoned him closer. "My mother wrote these to my father before I was born," she said softly, gesturing toward the letters. "Harrington found them among the old estate records and brought them to me today, along with an apology I did not expect but am grateful to have received." Nathaniel settled into the chair beside her, reading a few of the letters over her shoulder, his expression softening with each passage. "She sounds remarkable. I wish I had known her as well as I knew your father." "I wish I had known either of them at all," Eleanor said, though the old ache behind the words had softened considerably over the past year, tempered now by gratitude for everything she had managed to reclaim, piece by piece, since that first strange interview in Nathaniel's study. "But I am grateful, at least, to have these now. It feels like meeting her, in some small way, for the very first time." And they sat together as the afternoon light faded slowly toward evening, Eleanor reading passages aloud, Nathaniel listening with genuine interest, occasionally sharing his own memories of the woman her mother had been, small details he recalled from his friendship with her father that added further color to the picture slowly forming in Eleanor's mind. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of quiet, ordinary happiness she had never dared hope for during those long years in Bramfield, wondering endlessly about a past that felt permanently out of reach. Later that evening, as they prepared to return to Ashcombe Hall, Eleanor paused once more in the front hall of her father's house, looking back at the portraits now properly displayed along its walls, her parents finally restored to their rightful place of honor within the home they had once shared. She thought of Mrs. Bramwell, now living comfortably nearby, welcomed as a permanent and cherished member of the extended family, rather than a guardian whose secrets had once caused such painful upheaval. She thought of Mr. Ashworth, who continued to serve as a trusted advisor to both estates, his careful diligence having played no small part in securing the justice Eleanor now enjoyed. And she thought of Nathaniel, standing steadily beside her through every difficult revelation and dangerous threat, his love proven true not through grand gestures alone, but through 1,000 small, steady acts of patience and devotion across the many months since her true identity first came to light. She lingered a moment longer at the threshold, letting her gaze travel once more across the familiar rooms of her childhood home, rooms she had only truly come to know this past year, yet which already felt woven inseparably into her sense of who she was. The nursery where she had briefly slept as an infant now stood ready, freshly prepared at her own quiet instruction, waiting for a future she and Nathaniel had only recently begun to speak of in soft, hopeful tones during their private evenings together. She had not yet told him of the small suspicion growing within her these past weeks, a suspicion she intended to confirm properly before speaking it aloud, but standing there in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the restored legacy of a mother and father she had only just begun to know, she allowed herself to imagine, for a brief and tender moment, a child of her own someday walking these very halls, secure in a name and a history that would never need to be hidden away. "Are you ready?" he asked, offering his arm as the carriage waited outside. "Yes," she said, and found she meant it completely, in every sense the question could carry, ready to return home. ready to continue building the life they had chosen together, ready, at last, to carry her mother's letters and her father's memory forward, not as burdens of a hidden past, but as a foundation for everything still to come. They rode back toward Ashcombe Hall together beneath a sky turning soft shades of amber and rose, the wooden box of letters resting safely in Eleanor's lap, and she found herself thinking, as the familiar towers of the great house came into view against the darkening horizon, that her mother's final wish had been fulfilled far beyond anything Lady Catherine could have imagined when she first extracted that desperate promise from a trusted friend so many years before. Her daughter had not simply survived, she had found her name, her history, her courage, and a love built on truth rather than convenience, and in doing so, had honored every hope her mother had ever carried for the child she loved enough to protect at any cost.